In the long, dim world of Greek myth, creatures were rarely invented just to frighten. They often carried the shape of a landscape, a fear, a warning, or an old memory passed down through generations. Many of them seem strange to us now, but to the ancient Greeks they could feel wonderfully specific, almost as if the mountains, forests, and seas had quietly learned how to move and speak. Some were companions of gods, some guarded treasures, some punished human arrogance, and some simply marked the edges of the known world where stories could grow larger and more dreamlike. Even when the details differ from one ancient writer to another, the creatures themselves remain vivid, as if seen half in moonlight. One of the most familiar of these beings is the centaur, the half-human, half-horse creature that seems to belong perfectly to the Greek imagination. Centaurs were usually pictured as wild and impulsive, but not always cruel. Their lower bodies were those of horses, while their upper bodies were human, and this strange combination may have reflected how unsettling horses once seemed to people who had not grown up around mounted riders. To ancient audiences, the centaur could symbolize a tension between civilization and instinct, self-control and appetite. In some stories, centaurs are rough guests at a wedding who erupt into violence after drinking too much wine. In others, they are wise teachers, especially Chiron, who is unlike the rest of his kind and serves as a gentle mentor to heroes. That contrast matters because Greek myth often liked to show that nature itself could be both dangerous and noble, depending on how it was approached. The centaur, then, is not only a monster, but also a kind of living question about what it means to be fully human. From the open hills and wine-dark gatherings of centaurs, the myths move easily to the darker, more domestic threat of the harpy. Harpies were winged female figures associated with sudden snatching, violent winds, and the disturbing idea that something could be carried away before it was even fully understood. Ancient descriptions vary, but they are often imagined as part bird and part woman, with sharp claws and a terrible habit of appearing in moments of loss. Their name is connected to the Greek idea of seizing or snatching, which gives them a very specific kind of menace. They do not usually destroy by roaring or fighting. Instead, they arrive like a gust, leaving behind hunger, mess, and unease. In some later artistic traditions, they become more monstrous in appearance, but earlier texts often treat them as forces of punishment or disturbance rather than simple beasts. It is easy to see how such creatures would belong to a world where sudden storms, disappearing food, and unexplained misfortune could feel like the work of invisible hands. In that sense, the harpy lives at the edge of weather and nightmare, a creature made of movement, interruption, and appetite. If harpies seem like creatures of the air, the satyrs belong to a more earthy kind of mischief. They are companions of Dionysus, the god of wine, theatre, ecstasy, and blurred boundaries, and they are usually imagined as part human, part goat, or at least strongly goat-like in features and temperament. Satyrs are noisy, flirtatious, restless, and deeply interested in pleasure, music, and pursuit. Their world is one of pipes, dance, laughter, and the shadowed clearings of the countryside. In older Greek art, they can appear startlingly human with only a few animal traits, while later depictions emphasize their more obvious wildness. They are not merely comic figures, though they often are funny. They also embody the untamed side of desire and the thin line between delight and excess. Greek drama loved them for that reason, especially in satyr plays, where they offered a playful release after serious tragedy. The satyr reminds us that ancient myth did not divide the world neatly into sacred and profane. Sometimes the most spiritual experiences were also the most bodily, and sometimes wisdom arrived in the form of exuberant nonsense. Just beyond the satyrs, who are loud and lively, come the sirens, whose danger is quieter and in some ways more mysterious. In popular imagination, sirens are often combined with mermaid imagery, but in early Greek myth they were typically bird women, creatures with beautiful voices and deadly songs. Their power was not physical force but irresistible invitation. Sailors hearing them from their ships would be drawn toward the rocks and wrecked before they knew what was happening. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus famously has himself tied to the mast so he can hear the song without following it, while his men plug their ears with wax. That scene has stayed famous for centuries because it captures a very human fear, the possibility that something beautiful can also be ruinous. Sirens live in that uneasy place where longing becomes danger. Their songs may have promised knowledge, pleasure, or rest, but always at a cost. Ancient readers and listeners may have understood them as figures of temptation or as a poetic way to describe the dangers of maritime travel. Either way, the sirens remain among the most haunting creatures in Greek myth because they do not chase anyone. They simply sing, and the world around them goes still. Moving from the sea to the underworld, we find a creature that is often less glamorous but far more fundamental to Greek ideas of death. Cerberus, the many-headed hound who guards the gates of Hades. Cerberus is usually described as having 3 heads, though some ancient sources give him more or vary the details in other ways. He also has a serpent for a tail, and snakes may even emerge from his body in some accounts, reinforcing the sense that he belongs to a realm where life and death are strangely intertwined. Cerberus does not trap the dead inside Hades so much as prevent the living from entering and the dead from leaving. That role is deeply symbolic. In myth, the underworld is not a place meant for ordinary crossing, and Cerberus marks that boundary with canine vigilance. He appears in the labours of Heracles, who must bring him up from the underworld as one of his most difficult tasks. Yet even there, Cerberus is not purely evil. He is a guardian doing his duty, which is perhaps why he can feel both frightening and solemn. Like many Greek monsters, he serves an order rather than chaos, and that makes him more believable, almost more tragic than a creature who simply kills for pleasure. If Cerberus guards the threshold of the dead, the Sphinx guards riddles. This creature is especially associated with Thebes, where she posed a deadly question to travelers and devoured those who could not answer. In Greek tradition, the Sphinx is usually female, with the body of a lion, wings of a bird, and the head of a woman. She is different from the Egyptian Sphinx, though the traditions are related in distant and complicated ways. The Greek Sphinx is not a silent monument, but an intelligent menace, a being whose power lies in testing human understanding. Her famous riddle in the Theban story asks what creature walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening, a question answered by man, whose life begins in infancy, continues in adulthood, and ends in old age with the aid of a staff. When Oedipus solves it, the Sphinx destroys herself, as though knowledge itself has ended her role. That ending is important because the Sphinx is not just a beast of violence, she is a creature of interpretation. She stands for the terrifying moment when language becomes a trap and intelligence becomes survival. In a culture that prized cleverness but also feared overreaching, the Sphinx sits quietly at the border between wisdom and peril. The Greeks also imagined creatures that were not merely monstrous, but almost radiant in their impossible union of beauty and danger. The unicorn, interestingly, is not a major creature in early Greek myth in the way centaurs or sirens are, but ancient Greek writers did describe single-horned animals from faraway lands, especially in accounts that mixed observation, rumor, and wonder. These reports were often based on descriptions of real animals, such as the Indian rhinoceros, filtered through travelers' tales and scholarly speculation. Because of this, the unicorn in a Greek context is more a creature of geographical imagination than a central mythic figure. Still, it matters because it shows how Greek thought extended beyond the Mediterranean toward places that seemed filled with astonishing life. The single horn suggested rarity, purity, and an almost medicinal power, even though such meanings became more developed in later traditions. In Greek natural histories, the line between fact and marvel was never entirely fixed. A writer might be trying to describe the world, and at the same time building a dream of the world. The unicorn, then, belongs to that gentle frontier where geography becomes myth. In contrast to that distant softness, the giant often feels grounded in stone and earth. Greek giants were not always the same as later fantasy giants, and they should not be confused with ordinary, very large humans. In myth, the giants are a race born in opposition to the Olympian gods, often connected to primal chaos and violent struggle. The most famous conflict involving them is the Gigantomachy, a cosmic battle in which the gods, aided by heroes, defeat these immense opponents and establish divine order. Giants in Greek art can appear with serpent legs or monstrous features, depending on the period and the artist's invention. They are less like isolated monsters and more like forces of resistance against a newly organized cosmos. There is something almost geological about them, as if mountains themselves had stood up in anger. Yet the stories also suggest a deep anxiety about scale, rebellion, and the fragility of order. If the gods needed to fight the giants so fiercely, then civilization itself must have been understood as something hard-won, something protected against the return of older, rougher powers. The giant is therefore not just a creature of. Among the many creatures woven into Greek myth, the sirens are some of the most haunting, not because they are loud, but because they are so beautiful in their stillness. In the oldest stories, they are not always the mermaids people imagine today. They are often pictured as bird-bodied women, perched on rocky islands where the sea moves in a constant hush below them. Their power lies in song, in the promise that someone sailing past might hear a voice so lovely that everything else is forgotten. Ancient writers seem to understand them as creatures of dangerous knowledge as much as dangerous beauty, as if they sang not simply to please the ear, but to tempt the mind into drifting away from duty, memory, and home. Their island is never described with much comfort. It is a place of bones, white and sun-bleached, and winds that seem to carry music across the water. The sirens are therefore not only monsters of the sea, but guardians of a threshold, where curiosity becomes peril and longing becomes a kind of sleep. That sense of allure mixed with danger appears again in the legend of the Sphinx, though the Greek Sphinx is a very different being from the Egyptian one. In Greek myth, she is usually imagined with the body of a lion, the wings of a great bird, and the face of a woman, a combination that feels at once regal and unsettling. Her story is most famously tied to Thebes, where she waits and asks riddles to travelers, turning language itself into a gate that only the clever can pass. In some versions, she is sent by the gods as a punishment, a living test of insight and composure. She does not simply attack. She pauses. She speaks. She gives a question, and the answer becomes a matter of life and death. The creature's stillness is part of her threat. Lions embody force, birds suggest height and watchfulness, and the human face offers intelligence without mercy. Together, they create a figure that feels almost composed from different worlds, each part calm on its own, but strangely unnerving when joined. Greek myths are full of hybrid beings, and one of the most famous is the centaur, half human and half horse, a creature that seems to hold civilization and wilderness in the same body. The horse part carries speed, instinct, and untamed power. The human part suggests speech, reason, and the ability to make choices. This uneasy combination made centaurs especially useful in storytelling because they could stand for the tension between discipline and impulse. Some were wild and aggressive, prone to feasting and chaos, while others, like the wise Chiron, were gentle teachers associated with healing, music, and education. That contrast may be one reason centaurs have endured so strongly in the imagination. They do not belong entirely to the forest, or to the city, or to the stable. They are what happens when boundaries blur. Ancient art often showed them in motion, with arched necks and lifted forelegs, capturing the sense that a centaur is always on the edge of becoming either a man on horseback or something much older and more primal. If the centaur feels like a boundary between human and animal, the satyr lives somewhere closer to the edges of cultivated life and the raw, growing world. Satyrs are often depicted with shaggy hair, pointed ears, tails, and an untidy vitality that seems to belong to the woods, the vineyards, and the warm pulse of the earth. They are companions of Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and transformation, and they appear frequently in drama, vase painting, and poetry as figures of appetite, noise, and mischief. Yet even they are not always simple jokes. Satyrs can represent the unruly forces that civilization tries to contain but never fully removes. Their laughter, their dancing, their desire for music and pleasure all suggest a world where restraint loosens and instinct comes forward. In some traditions, their behavior is comic. In others, it is slightly threatening, as if the forest has begun to look back. The satyr reminds us that the Greeks did not imagine nature as quiet and harmless. They understood it as animated, watchful, and full of life pressing at the edges. Near the satyrs in tone, though different in shape, are the nymphs, whose very presence gives Greek myth a softer, greener atmosphere. Nymphs are not usually monstrous in the modern sense. They are spirits of springs, trees, groves, mountains, and streams, and they help make the natural world feel inhabited by gentle intelligence. A cool pool under reeds, the shade beneath an old olive tree, the sound of water over stone. These are the kinds of places where nymphs are imagined to dwell. They are often beautiful, but their beauty is less like a trap and more like the quiet radiance of a landscape at rest. Still, myth never leaves them entirely untouched by danger. Some nymphs can be elusive, some can be sorrowful, and some can be pursued by gods and mortals who do not know how to respect the sacredness of the place they enter. In that way, nymphs are not merely decorative spirits. They mark the idea that certain parts of nature have their own dignity, and that to encounter them is to enter a space of reverence and caution. That reverence becomes even more vivid in stories of dragons and serpent-like guardians, which in Greek myth are often associated with protecting sanctuaries, treasures, or ancient powers. The Greek word used for such creatures could refer to huge serpents, and while they may not resemble the fire-breathing dragons of later medieval tales, they still carry an aura of age, vigilance, and depth. A serpent coiled around a sacred tree or guarding a spring suggests a world where knowledge is kept behind living barriers. Dragons in myth often appear at the edges of civilization, at the borders of the known and the unknown, where heroes must prove themselves not just strong, but persistent. Their bodies, long and cold and scaled, seem to belong to the earth itself. They are not creatures of sudden motion so much as enduring presence. The Greeks often linked them with places of prophecy or sacred memory, which makes them feel less like simple beasts and more like embodiments of ancient watchfulness. Their silence, in many ways, is their most impressive trait. Sometimes Greek mythology describes creatures that are less well known, but deeply interesting, such as the Empusa. This being appears in later traditions as a shape-shifting demon or phantom, often linked to nighttime fear, seduction, and the unsettling uncertainty of what is real. Empusa is said in some accounts to disguise herself, sometimes with one leg of brass and other grotesque details that made her especially memorable in the imagination. She belongs to the shadowy border between myth and cautionary tale, the sort of figure that might be used to explain strange feelings in the dark or the danger of wandering alone at night. Her power lies not in brute force, but in confusion. Ancient storytelling often gave form to anxiety by turning it into a creature. Empusa is one such form, a reminder that not all monsters roar. Some arrive as a passing impression, a flicker at the edge of awareness, a story told softly so that children will stay close to the fire. Even more frightening, though less visually elaborate, are the Lamii, beings associated with devouring children in later Greek tradition, and with a terrible, sorrowful transformation in older variants. Their stories vary, as so many mythic stories do, but one common thread is that they move between the human and the monstrous, often as a consequence of divine punishment, grief, or loss. That ambiguity gives them a special kind of emotional weight. They are not simply evil from the beginning, they are often imagined as having once been something else. This makes them feel closer to tragedy than to pure horror. In the background of the Lamia stories is a sense that myth was used to explain not only fear, but the way suffering can warp a being into something unrecognizable. Their presence in Greek lore also reflects the larger tendency of ancient tales to mix caution with sorrow, so that a creature of terror may also carry a trace of pity. In the stillness of the night, such a figure becomes less like a spectacle and more like a warning wrapped in grief. The harpies belong to a different kind of unease. They are often depicted as women with bird bodies or bird-like features, and their name is tied to ideas of snatching, seizing, and carrying away. This gives them a restless, abrupt quality in myth, as if they arrive like a gust of wind and leave the air disturbed behind them. They are not usually the sort of creatures who linger. They descend, take what they want, and vanish. In some stories, they serve as agents of punishment, tormenting a suffering man by stealing or fouling his food. Their role can feel strangely domestic and terrible at once, because the violation occurs in the most ordinary of acts, such as eating a meal. This may be part of why harpies remained so memorable. They embody the fear that even basic comfort can be interrupted by something swift, unclean, and beyond control. In the imagination of the sea and sky, they are both wind and appetite, movement made into menace. The Gorgons, especially Medusa, are perhaps among the most visually powerful of all Greek creatures, not because every account agrees on their appearance, but because the idea of them has such force. They are often imagined with snakes for hair, a gaze that petrifies, and a face that combines beauty and terror in equal measure. Of the three famous Gorgons, Medusa became the most enduring, partly because later storytellers gave her a tragic and memorable history. She is not always a creature born monstrous. In some traditions, she is transformed, which changes the emotional texture of her myth entirely. Her face becomes a warning about looking too directly, about the danger of the gaze. Among the more familiar creatures of Greek myth is the centaur, and yet the ancient imagination around them was often more varied than the usual image of a man with a horse's body. In some stories, centaurs are wild and unruly, appearing at weddings and feasts as though they are only a step away from chaos. But in other traditions, they are not simply beasts at all. They are creatures of mountains and caves, linked to the rhythm of the wilderness, with hair that could catch the light like dry grass and voices that seem half human, half echo. The best-known centaurs came from Thessaly and Arcadia, regions that the Greeks themselves often imagined as distant and rugged, places where civilization thinned and older powers could still be felt in the wind. Some scholars suggest that the centaur may have emerged from early encounters with horse-riding peoples, because to a community unfamiliar with mounted riders, horse and rider might appear fused into one uncanny being. Whatever their origin, centaurs became a powerful image of divided nature, the tension between reason and appetite, gentleness and frenzy, and that idea gave them a lasting place in mythology. From the open hills, the mind can move to the deep sea, where the Greeks imagined a whole family of strange beings that were not always monstrous in the modern sense, but ancient and elemental. Among these were the Nereids, sea nymphs who were often described as graceful, luminous, and responsive to the movements of the water. They were daughters of Nereus, the old man of the sea, and their number was said to be 50, though myths rarely pause to make them feel like a counting exercise. Instead, they appear as a shimmering group, almost like sunlight scattered over waves. In art and poetry, Nereids sometimes ride dolphins or sea horses, carrying gifts for heroes or lamenting over human sorrow. They belong to a world where the sea is not just a route or a border, but a living presence with moods and memory. The Greek coastline, full of coves, inlets, and sudden storms, surely helped shape this sense that water could be inhabited by personalities as much as by creatures. To sailors and island communities, such beings may have given poetic form to hope, danger, and the quiet beauty of the moving deep. Not all Greek mythical creatures were enormous or dramatic. Some were tiny, almost delicate in the way they entered the stories. The Pygmies, for example, were a legendary people sometimes described in relation to birds and cranes, a curious and distant race found at the edge of the world. Greek authors did not agree on their exact nature, and that uncertainty is part of what makes them interesting. In some accounts, they were a real people imagined through the distortion of rumor and far-off travel. In others, they were entirely mythic, living in miniature landscapes and defending themselves from migrating flocks. Their presence in ancient storytelling shows how the Greeks loved to place strange beings in remote geographies, where the known world could dissolve into speculation. The Pygmies also reveal a broader habit of myth, to turn the unfamiliar into a narrative. A small people at the world's edge may have been a way of reflecting wonder at the diversity of human life, but also the unreliability of information in a time when distant lands reached the imagination through fragments, traders, and travelers' tales. In the quiet of those old stories, even a tiny figure could become enormous in meaning. If the Pygmies belonged to the far reaches of geography, the Harpies belonged more to the unsettled regions of the sky and the air. Their name is often translated as snatchers, which gives a clue to their role in myth. They were wind-like beings, fast and sudden, associated with violent weather, theft, and pollution. In some early descriptions, they may have been less hideous than later art made them, more like swift-winged women than the terrifying creatures of medieval imagination. But over time, they became increasingly grim, with sharp talons and faces that seemed designed to embody disturbance itself. They appear in the story of Phineas, where they torment an old seer and spoil his food before the arrival of the Argonauts. That scene has always carried a strange atmosphere, almost ceremonial in its suffering, as if hunger, breath, and interruption have become a single curse. The Harpies may reflect the Greeks' sense that wind could be both necessary and punishing, carrying ships, clouds, and storms with equal indifference. In this way, they feel less like invented monsters and more like weather given a will, which is perhaps one of the oldest impulses in mythology. Moving from the air back to the earth, one finds the satyrs, those rustic companions of Dionysus who seem to stand at the edge of control, music, and intoxication. Their bodies were often imagined as human with animal features, sometimes goat-like, sometimes with ears, tails, and shaggy hair that made them look as though the forest itself had learned to dance. Satyrs are not exactly tragic and not exactly comic. They inhabit a restless middle place. They are connected to wine, desire, and reverie, but also to the wildness that civilized life keeps trying and failing to contain. In vase painting and theatre, they often appear leaping, chasing, playing pipes, or peering with absurd curiosity. Yet behind the humor there is a serious mythic function. The satyr expresses the impulse toward liberation, the loosening of social form, the moment when ordinary structure gives way to music and animal energy. Greek religion did not always divide sacred and unruly things as sharply as modern thought sometimes does. In the Dionysian world, the satyr reminds us that ecstasy can be both joyous and unsettling, and that the border between celebration and frenzy is sometimes very thin indeed. Not far from the satyrs in spirit, though more singular in their fame, are the sirens. They are often remembered today as mermaid-like figures, but in Greek tradition they were more commonly bird-bodied women, creatures whose beauty came not from appearance alone but from voice. Their danger was not the physical force of claws or teeth, but the pull of song. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is warned to resist them, and the scene has stayed in cultural memory for centuries. The ship gliding past the island, the men with wax in their ears, and the hero tied to the mast as he listens helplessly to a knowledge that seems almost too lovely to survive. The sirens represent temptation in one of its most refined forms. They do not simply lure sailors toward death, they promise understanding, revelation, and rest. Ancient artists often showed them perched on rocks or grave markers, which suggests a link with lamentation and the passage between life and death. Some scholars think their song may once have been connected to mourning rites or soul-guiding traditions, though the evidence remains uncertain. Whatever their origin, the sirens feel like an image of the mind itself when it is drawn toward what it cannot safely hold. The Minotaur belongs to a different register of the Greek imagination, one shaped by labyrinths, kingship, and hidden shame. This creature, half man and half bull, lived at the center of the Cretan labyrinth, a place so tangled in legend that it has become a symbol of confusion in itself. The Minotaur's story is tied to the house of Minos and to divine punishment, though the myth is complex and layered, with older Cretan religious traditions likely woven into the later Greek version. Bulls held immense symbolic importance in the Aegean world, especially in Minoan culture, where bull leaping and bull imagery appear frequently in art. That background may help explain why the Minotaur feels less like a random invention and more like a memory transformed into a monster. The labyrinth, too, may have reflected real palace complexes or ceremonial spaces whose layout seemed intricate to outsiders. In the myth, the creature's loneliness is part of the atmosphere. He is terrifying, yes, but also profoundly isolated, imprisoned in a structure built to hide what cannot be openly faced. That mixture of fear and pity gives the Minotaur a strangely human depth, even while his form remains unmistakably bestial. The Chimera offers another hybrid shape, but one that seems born not of shame and confinement, but of pure imaginative excess. Usually described as having the body of a lion, a goat emerging from its back or middle, and a serpent for a tail, the Chimera seems almost deliberately impossible, as if several beasts were assembled into one figure to test the limits of description. It breathes fire in many versions of the myth, and that fire makes it feel volcanic, arid, and linked to the dangerous landscapes of Anatolia, where ancient stories placed it. Some scholars connect the Chimera to natural features or to regional symbols, especially since the name may have had associations with goats and rugged terrain. In Homer, the creature is already ancient, already famous, already difficult to account for. Yet the word chimera came to mean any fanciful or impossible mixture, which shows how powerful the image became. There is something dreamlike in the creature's arrangement, as though the mind, encountering it, cannot decide whether to recall or admire its inventiveness. It stands for combination gone wild, the strange beauty of things that should not fit together but somehow do. A quieter kind of wonder appears in the myth of the dryads, tree nymphs who belong to the living fabric of the forest. Unlike monsters that threaten from the margins, dryads are deeply tied to place, and especially to trees that are themselves part of a sacred and vulnerable world. In some traditions, a dryad's life is linked to her tree so closely that harm to the tree brings harm to the nymph as well. This idea gives the forest a palpable intimacy, as if bark and breath, leaf and soul, were not separate things at all. The Greeks, who lived among groves, orchards, and mountain woods, clearly understood the quiet power of trees as more than scenery. Sacred trees were common. Among the many creatures that drift through Greek myth, the satyr holds a strangely gentle place in the imagination. He is usually described as part man and part horse, or later more often part man and part goat, with pointed ears, a shaggy body, and a taste for wine, music, and dancing. Yet the satyr is not always a frightening being. In some vase paintings and ancient stories, he seems less like a monster and more like a restless companion of the wild countryside, forever running between order and abandon. He belongs to the retinue of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, and his presence often suggests the edge of civilization, where fields soften into forest and the sound of the flute carries through the evening air. Scholars have long noted that satyrs can look different from one era to another because Greek artists were not always consistent. Some made them more animal-like, others more human, and later Roman art softened them even further. That shifting appearance may be part of why they endure so easily in memory. They are creatures of transition, not fully tame, not fully wild, and always hovering in that dreamy borderland between laughter and unease. Close beside them in the mythic landscape stand the centaurs, those famous beings with the body of a horse and the torso of a man. Their stories are often filled with violence, especially in the well-known battle at the wedding feast of the Lapiths, where drunken centaurs erupted into chaos. But ancient tradition was not entirely uniform in its view of them. Some centaurs are rough and unruly, while others, most notably Chiron, are wise teachers associated with healing, hunting, and the care of heroes. This contrast makes the centaurs feel particularly human in spirit, as if Greek myth were trying to say that strength alone is never the whole story. Their equine bodies connect them to speed, instinct, and the open land, while their human upper half allows for speech, craft, and judgment. It is a startling image, but also a memorable one, perhaps because it seems to capture the tension between impulse and reason in a single living form. Their presence in art and literature remained powerful for centuries, likely because they could represent either danger or discipline, depending on the needs of the tale. Far quieter but no less haunting are the harpies. Their name is often translated as snatchers, and that simple meaning fits them well, for they are creatures of sudden seizure and disappearance. In early Greek poetry, they appear as wind spirits who carry people or things away with uncanny speed, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as a sign of divine disturbance. Later authors gave them the bodies of birds of prey with the faces of women, a combination that is both elegant and deeply unsettling. Their wings suggest motion more than form, and their role in myth often feels like the moment when a meal is interrupted, a path is crossed, or a life is taken beyond human reach. In some accounts, they torment the blind seer Phineus by stealing his food before he can eat, a detail that gives the story an almost cold physical misery. Yet even the harpies seem to belong to the winds themselves, and perhaps that is why they can feel less like ordinary villains and more like forces of nature given a face. They are sudden air, shadow, hunger, and passing. If harpies feel like the sting of the wind, the sirens feel like its song. These creatures are among the most famous in all of Greek myth, though their appearance changed over time. In later art, they are often shown as birds with women's heads or upper bodies, perched in lonely places and singing with exquisite sweetness. Their power is not brute force but attraction, and that may be why they remain so memorable. The sirens do not chase sailors, they call to them. In the Odyssey, their song promises knowledge, and that promise is part of the danger. It suggests that what they offer is not merely pleasure, but the chance to hear something beyond mortal limits. Ancient audiences may have understood them as embodiments of irresistible temptation, especially the kind that sounds beautiful precisely because it leads to ruin. Their island is never described in detail for long, but one can imagine the white glare of sun on stone, the slow turning of water, and the fragile human ship drawn closer by curiosity. In that way, the sirens become not only monsters, but a meditation on longing itself. The Sphinx, by contrast, combines beauty and menace in a single, still form. Unlike the winged Egyptian Sphinx, the Greek Sphinx is usually female, with the body of a lion, the wings of a bird, and the face of a woman. She is best known from the story of Oedipus, where she poses a riddle to those who enter Thebes and destroys anyone who cannot answer. The riddle itself became one of the most famous in Western literature, but the creature behind it is just as intriguing. The Sphinx represents a test that is both intellectual and mortal, a boundary that must be crossed with insight rather than force. Some scholars have wondered whether the myth may preserve older ritual ideas about guarding thresholds or sacred places. Others see her simply as a dramatic figure for the terror of not knowing. Her very stillness is part of her power. She does not rush, roar, or swarm. She waits. In art, that stillness is often poised and elegant, which only deepens the unease. She is beautiful enough to draw the eye, and dangerous enough to make the gaze feel risky. Then there is Cerberus, the hound of the underworld, whose many heads have made him one of the most recognizable monsters in Greek myth. He is usually said to have 3 heads, though ancient sources sometimes vary, and he is often depicted with a serpent for a tail or with snakes emerging from his body. His role is simple and eternal. He guards the entrance to Hades and prevents the dead from leaving. In some ways, he is less a villain than a boundary keeper, a creature whose terrifying appearance serves a practical cosmic purpose. That idea may explain why Cerberus appears in stories of Heracles, who had to seize him as one of his labors. The feat was meant to be nearly impossible, but it was also symbolic, bringing a living hero face to face with death's threshold. Cerberus has a strange dignity in his task. He is not a beast wandering without meaning. He belongs to the architecture of the afterlife. The presence of his barking, imagined or remembered, seems to echo from a dark gate where earth grows cold and silence thickens around the stones. The Hydra, on the other hand, is a monster of multiplication. Most famously associated with the marshes of Lerna, it is described as a serpent-like creature with many heads, and when one head was cut off, others could grow in its place. This feature has made the Hydra a lasting symbol for problems that seem to worsen when attacked directly. In myth, Heracles eventually defeats it with the help of fire and strategy, not brute strength alone, which may be part of the reason the tale feels so satisfying. The Hydra itself is said to have been poisonous, and even its breath could be deadly. It lived in a wet, shadowed place where reed beds and stagnant water would have created a thick, low landscape, very different from the bright heroics of mountain or battlefield. Ancient authors and artists did not always agree on the exact number of its heads, which is perhaps fitting for a creature defined by excess and instability. The Hydra is not one threat, but many, and each answer seems to make room for another. In that sense, it becomes almost a mythic pattern rather than a single beast. Even more elusive is the Chimera, a creature whose body appears assembled from several different animals. In the classical description, it had the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and a serpent for a tail, though some versions add fire breathing to the mix. It is a being of impossible combination, and that may be why its name eventually came to mean something imagined or unreal. The original myth places the Chimera in Lycia, where she was slain by Bellerophon riding Pegasus. That union of hero, horse, and divine favor contrasts sharply with the Chimera's unnatural fusion, almost as if the story were arranging order against disorder. Some historians have suggested that the Chimera may have grown from older Near Eastern hybrid imagery, passed through trade and storytelling into Greek myth. Whether or not that is true, the creature carries the sense of a world where boundaries do not hold. Fire, in particular, gives the Chimera a vivid presence, because flame is both visible and uncontrollable, bright yet fleeting. She seems less like an animal than an embodied impossibility, a reminder that the mythic mind loved to imagine forms that could never stand in ordinary daylight. At times, Greek myth turns from full creatures to beings that are almost creatures, almost gods, almost weather. The nymphs belong here. They are not monsters in the usual sense, but they are undeniably part of the magical population of Greek stories, and they often dwell in caves, trees, springs, and mountain glades. There are many kinds of nymphs, including naiads of fresh water, dryads of trees, and oreads of mountains, each tied intimately to a particular place. Their lives are long, graceful, and closely woven into the landscape itself. In literature, they may appear as companions of Artemis, as singers and dancers, or as objects of desire for gods and mortals. Yet their stories also carry a quieter, more fragile note. A nymph can disappear with the tree she inhabits, or vanish when the spring dries, which makes her existence feel tied to the health of the earth. Ancient viewers may have sensed in them not only beauty, but place memory, the idea that a grove or stream. In Greek myth, monsters were rarely just monsters. Many of the creatures that appear in old stories seem to live between categories, as if the ancient imagination was trying to explain the uneasy places where the familiar world ended and the unknown began. One of the most memorable examples is the Gorgons. especially Medusa, whose face could turn a living person to stone. In later art, her hair becomes a nest of snakes, each one coiled like a living thread. Yet the oldest versions of the tale feel older than a simple horror story. Some scholars think the Gorgons may once have been guardian figures, connected to thresholds, tombs, or sacred spaces. Their terrible faces meant not only to frighten but to protect. It is easy to imagine such an image carved on stone in a dim sanctuary, where oil lamps flickered and cast trembling shadows over the serpent locks and wide-staring eyes. The power of the Gorgon lay in her stillness as much as in her violence. She did not chase her victims. She waited, and the danger was in looking too directly. From the Gorgons, it is only a small step to another creature that lived at the edge of the known world, the sirens. These beings are often pictured today as mermaids, but the earliest Greek sirens were not fish-tailed at all. They were bird-like, with the bodies of women and the wings or feathers of birds, and they sat on rocky shores singing with such sweetness that sailors forgot everything else. Their song was not merely pleasant, it was deeply dangerous because it promised knowledge, memory, and rest. In the Odyssey, Odysseus must be bound to his ship's mast so that he can hear the music without steering toward disaster. The scene feels almost unnervingly quiet, as though the whole sea has paused to listen. There is something deeply human in the idea that the most perilous thing might not be a roar or a claw, but a voice that speaks directly to longing. The sirens belong to the ancient fear of surrendering too much of oneself to beauty. Not all Greek creatures were terrifying in a direct way. Some were strange, beautiful, and intimate with daily life, like the satyrs. Satyrs were woodland beings associated with fertility, wine, music, and unruly appetite. They are often shown with horse ears, tails, and sometimes more exaggerated features that mark them as half human, half animal. In the company of Dionysus, god of wine and transformation, they dance in hills, fields, and forest spaces beyond the polite order of the city. Their presence suggests a world that is loosened, warm with fermentation, filled with the scent of grapes, pine resin, and earth after rain. Satyrs were comic figures as well as wild ones, and they remind us that Greek myth did not separate the sacred from the bodily in the way later cultures sometimes did. Their laughter and mischief belong to the same landscape as religious ecstasy and seasonal renewal. In a strange way, they are less like monsters and more like a release valve for the pressures of civilization. That sense of wildness becomes even gentler, though no less mysterious. In the figure of Pan was not exactly a creature in the same way as a dragon or a cyclops, but he had the body of a goat below the waist, the horns, and the shaggy presence of a being who belonged entirely to mountain slopes and remote valleys. He inspired what we still call panic, a sudden fear that comes without warning, especially in lonely places. Yet Pan was also a flute player, and his music was said to drift through reeds and over stone with a soft, haunting sound. The Pan flute itself carries that memory, each note airy and rustic, as if the wind had learned to sing. Pan feels like an embodiment of the untamed countryside, not evil, only indifferent to human comfort. In Greek thought, that kind of presence could be sacred. It could frighten shepherds and still be worthy of reverence. The wild does not always mean hostile. Sometimes it means older than us and impossible to fully domesticate. If Pan represents the open hills, then the centaurs belong to the border between civilization and the forested unknown. These creatures had the upper body of a man and the lower body of a horse, and they were often imagined as impulsive, fierce, and difficult to control. Yet the centaur tradition is not entirely simple. Some centaurs, like Chiron, were wise healers and teachers rather than raging figures of chaos. Chiron is said to have instructed heroes such as Achilles and Jason, and he stands apart from the more unruly centaurs of myth. The contrast is important. The Greeks seem to have used the centaur shape to think about human nature itself, reason joined to instinct, discipline joined to speed, thought riding on force. The horse body suggests motion, stamina, and the open plain, while the human torso introduces speech, skill, and moral choice. A centaur image painted on a vase or whispered in a story would have carried both admiration and unease. It asks whether strength can be guided or whether it simply gallops away from restraint. There is a quieter kind of creature in Greek myth as well, one that appears in gardens, mountains, and near sacred springs: the nymph. Nymphs were female spirits of nature, often associated with particular places such as rivers, trees, meadows, caves, or sea coves. Unlike a single monstrous species, they formed a broad family of divine presences, and that makes them feel especially close to the landscape itself. A grove with a nymph in it is not just a grove anymore. It has attention. It is watched. It is alive with personality. Ancient people may have imagined the rustle of leaves, the movement of water, or the sudden perfume of blossoms as signs that a nymph was near. Some nymphs were playful and kind, while others were elusive or dangerous if disturbed. Their beauty could be overwhelming, but it was also fragile, tied to the place they inhabited. When the river dries or the tree is cut down, the spirit seems to thin with it. In that sense, the nymphs preserve a memory of nature as something inhabited, not empty. Alongside the nymphs, the dryads occupy a particularly lovely and melancholy corner of myth. Dryads were tree nymphs, linked especially to oaks and forests, and their lives were said to be bound to the health of the tree they dwelled in. If the tree flourished, so did the dryad. If it was cut down, the dryad might perish as well. This idea gives the forest a hushed dignity, as though every trunk held a hidden life. Ancient woodland was not simply scenery, it was a community of beings, visible and invisible. The dryad myth may also reflect an older reverence for trees as sacred beings or as markers of divine presence. One can imagine a traveler in the cool shade of leaves, hearing the soft crack of branches overhead, feeling that the place is listening back. There is something tender in the notion that a tree might have a soul. It slows the mind. It makes cutting wood into a moral act, not just a practical one. The dryads remind us that the Greek imagination could be deeply delicate, even in its stories of enchantment. From the woods, we move to the sea, where the Nereids glide through the salt water with an entirely different kind of grace. The Nereids were sea nymphs, daughters of the old sea god Nereus, and they were often pictured as benevolent or at least helpful figures, especially to sailors in distress. Their world is one of brightness and motion. Sunlight on waves, foam curling against rock, the silver flash of fish below the surface. Unlike the more fearsome sea monsters, the Nereids suggest the soothing side of the ocean, the part that carries, cradles, and reflects the sky. In some myths, they attend major divine events and accompany Poseidon, but they also seem to embody the many moods of the Mediterranean Sea itself, which can be calm one moment and restless the next. Their beauty is not sharp or threatening. It is fluid, changing, impossible to hold. The Greeks knew, as coastal people often do, that the sea can be both shelter and uncertainty, and the Nereids give that duality a face. Then there are the Harpies, whose name still carries a sense of sudden interference, as if something has snatched away what was meant to stay. In myth, Harpies were winged spirits or monsters who carried off food, people, or breath itself, often arriving with foul winds and leaving behind a sense of violation. Their image changed over time, but they were frequently described as women with bird bodies or wings, sharp talons, and a terrible, invasive presence. They were not always central villains. Sometimes they appear in punishing roles, sent by the gods to torment mortals. This gives them a strange moral ambiguity. The Harpies are like storms with personalities, embodying the experience of loss that comes from forces no one can argue with. They descend suddenly, and the air itself feels unclean. Ancient literature sometimes uses them to represent harsh interruption, the way a feast may be ruined or a journey made impossible. The image is so effective because it captures a sensation as much as a creature, the feeling of something being taken before one can fully understand what happened. A creature even more ancient and earthbound is the chimera, one of the most famous hybrid monsters in Greek myth. The chimera is often described as part lion, part goat, and part serpent, with a body assembled from separate dangerous animals into one impossible form. It breathes fire and stands for disorder made visible. Yet the word itself has travelled far beyond the myth. Even now, people use chimera to mean an unreal or blended thing, a dream of something that cannot exist exactly as imagined. The original myth may have roots in the Near East as well as Greece, which reminds us that stories. In many old Greek stories, the centaur Chiron stands apart from the rest of his kind. While other centaurs are often imagined as wild and unruly, Chiron is usually described as wise, gentle, and deeply knowledgeable. He lived on Mount Pelion, in a landscape of pine trees, cold streams and quiet slopes where a student might imagine hearing only the wind and the distant call of birds. Ancient writers often gave him the task of teaching heroes, and among his pupils were Achilles, Asclepius, Jason, and other figures who would later move through myth as if carrying a little of his calm instruction with them. He was skilled in medicine, music, hunting, and the careful reading of plants, which made him something like a sacred teacher of the natural world. Some stories say that he was accidentally wounded and suffered terribly, though he was immortal, which gave his myth a sad and thoughtful tone. Because of this, Chiron was sometimes seen less as a beast and more as a bridge between the animal body and the cultivated mind. In vase paintings and later literature, his presence brings a quieter dignity to the centaur tradition, as if myth itself pauses for a moment and becomes reflective. A different kind of creature appears in the familiar shape of the Sphinx, though in Greek myth it is usually not the kind of benevolent guardian that later art sometimes suggests. Most readers meet the Sphinx in the story of Oedipus, where she sits near Thebes and asks a deadly riddle to anyone who passes. Her body is often described as a lion's body with a woman's face, and sometimes wings like a bird's, making her a layered and unsettling figure, made from several strong forms at once. The Greeks may have drawn some inspiration from Egyptian sphinxes, though the Greek version became far more threatening and enigmatic. In the cool language of myth, she is not only a monster but also a test of intelligence, a creature who turns speech into a trap and knowledge into survival. Her riddle about what walks on 4 legs, then 2, then 3, is among the most famous in all ancient storytelling. When the answer is finally given, the Sphinx's power ends and she vanishes from the tale. Yet the lingering feeling is less one of triumph than of quiet relief, as if the ancient world has exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Among the more sorrowful creatures of Greek imagination are the sirens, who are often misunderstood in later retellings. They were not originally the mermaid-like beings of modern illustration, but bird-bodied women whose voices carried across the sea. Their songs were said to be exquisitely beautiful, full of longing and knowledge, and perhaps that is what made them dangerous. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is warned to avoid them, because sailors who heard their music would forget home, duty, and even the desire to return. The island where they lived is usually placed in some uncertain and shifting location, perhaps near the rocky edges of the Mediterranean, where cliffs and water could create a natural stage for echoes and illusion. Ancient artists often painted them with feathers, wings, and the upper bodies of women, their appearance both graceful and uncanny. The sirens were not simply monstrous voices, but symbols of seductive danger, the kind that arrives softly and never seems dangerous at first. Their story feels almost like a hush over the sea, a reminder that beauty in myth is often mixed with loss. In that sense, they belong to the quieter warnings of Greek tradition, where sound itself becomes a kind of enchantment. Not all mythical beings were singular in form. Some, like the Harpies, were imagined as a disturbance made flesh. Their name is often translated in ways that suggest snatching or seizing, and in many myths they appear as stormy, bird-like women who dart in and out of the air. They were associated with violent winds, sudden disappearances, and the spoiling of food, which gives them a strangely domestic kind of menace. In stories such as those of Phineas, the harpies torment a mortal man by stealing or defiling his meals, turning hunger into a punishment that repeats endlessly. Ancient descriptions vary, and some portray them as ugly creatures with clawed feet and haggard faces, while others give them a more bird-like elegance. This uncertainty is part of their enduring strangeness, because they seem less like fully fixed beings and more like a force of nature given a face. The harpies occupy the border between weather and creature, between appetite and interruption. In the stillness of myth, they feel like a sudden gust through an open doorway, brief but impossible to ignore. A gentler and more luminous tradition speaks of the Hesperides, the maidens of the evening who guarded a far western garden. Their golden apples were among the most coveted objects in myth, and the garden itself is often placed at the edge of the world, where daylight fades into a softer color and the air seems touched by dusk. Some ancient sources describe the Hesperides as daughters of night or of twilight, while others make them companions of the divine landscape. Their exact number changes from one telling to another, which is typical of Greek myth, where beauty is often allowed to remain slightly unresolved. The dragon or serpent Ladon was said to guard the apples alongside them, making the garden both welcoming and impossible to enter. Hercules, labor involving the apples gave the garden its best-known story, though the Hesperides themselves remain more atmospheric than central, like figures glimpsed in the distance at the end of a long path. There is something restful in their association with evening and fruit and enclosed gardens. They belong to that part of myth where the world grows quiet, leaves tremble in dim light, and time seems to slow. The Gree are even stranger in their quietness, 3 old women who share a small number of eyes and a single tooth among them. Their appearance is unsettling not because of violence, but because of scarcity and shared dependence. In the story of Perseus, they are often described as sisters of the Gorgons, and their shared eye becomes a useful detail in the hero's journey. Ancient writers may have imagined them as beings of the grey dawn, their name connected to age or greyness, which gives them a colourless and misted quality. They are not usually the centre of their own stories, yet they remain memorable because their bodies express a very different kind of mythic imagination, one in which personhood is fragmented and communal. Their shared eye suggests a world of incomplete vision, where knowledge must be passed carefully from one being to another. Some versions describe them as living in a far-off place beyond ordinary human reach, and this distance adds to their eerie charm. They feel like figures from a half-dream, seated together in dim light, passing a single glance between them. Then there are the Gorgons, and especially Medusa, who perhaps became the most famous of all Greek monsters. Her image has changed so much over time that it is difficult to hold one fixed version in mind. In earlier traditions, the Gorgons are monstrous sisters with snaky hair and terrifying faces, beings so dreadful that their very sight can turn viewers to stone. By the classical period, Medusa in particular becomes a tragic figure in some interpretations, sometimes described as once beautiful before a curse transformed her. Whether or not that version was original, it has deeply shaped later imagination. The severing of Medusa's head by Perseus is one of the most vivid scenes in myth, and after death her head remains powerful enough to be used as protection, an apotropaic image meant to ward off evil. This strange double meaning, both deadly and protective, makes the Gorgon especially rich in symbolism. She is fear and defense, loss and power all braided together. Ancient pottery, temple decoration, and later sculpture often used her face as a stern guardian at thresholds, where her wild expression could keep danger away. In that sense, the Gorgon is not only a monster to be defeated, but a form of power that remains even after the story ends. Another creature of transformation is the Nemean lion, which is often grouped with monsters even though it is more animal than hybrid. It lived in the region of Nemea and was said to have skin so tough that ordinary weapons could not pierce it. In the labor of Hercules, the lion becomes a test of sheer strength and ingenuity, forcing the hero into close physical struggle. The cave where it lived is often imagined as dark and damp, with the smell of earth and old stone, a place where sunlight arrived only in narrow angles. After Hercules killed the lion, he wore its skin, which became one of the most recognizable symbols in his mythic identity. The animal itself may have been linked to older local cults or to symbolic ideas of wild force that must be brought under control. Unlike the more fantastical beings in Greek myth, the Nemean lion feels grounded and heavy, its power almost tactile. It represents the edge where creature becomes challenge and challenge becomes legend. The story has a plain, muscular gravity to it, as if myth briefly trades enchantment for endurance. The Hydra of Lerna belongs to the same circle of heroic labor, yet its image is more fluid and unsettling. It is usually described as a many-headed serpent or dragon-like creature that lived in the marshes near Lerna, a place associated with dampness, stagnant water, and ancient religious memory. Every time one head was cut off, others would grow in its place, making the Hydra a symbol of a problem that multiplies when attacked too simply. Ancient versions vary in the exact number of heads, and that uncertainty suits the creature well, because it is less a fixed monster than a recurring difficulty. The swampy setting matters too, since marshlands in the ancient imagination often carried associations of disease, hidden life, and things that emerge from below there. Among the many strange beings that drift through Greek myth, the centaurs stand out because they seem to belong to two worlds at once. Their upper bodies are human, capable of speech, thought, and skilled hands, while their lower bodies are horse, powerful and restless, built for speed across wild terrain. Ancient storytellers often place them in mountain regions and forested edges, places where civilization thinned and the landscape grew rough and quiet. In some tales they are chaotic and dangerous, driven by appetite and quick anger, but in others they are not simply monsters at all. The centaur Chiron, for example, is remembered as wise, patient, and gentle, a teacher of heroes rather than an enemy. This contrast suggests that Greek myth did not see the centaur as one single idea, but as a broad image of untamed nature, where brute force and noble knowledge could exist side by side. Even their unusual shape may have once felt shocking to early listeners, as if the boundary between human order and animal power had suddenly become visible. From the rugged highlands of Thessaly, the Greeks imagined another odd and elusive creature, the satyr. Satyrs are not quite horses and not quite men, but rather woodland beings tied to wine, music, dance, and uncontrolled desire. They are often described with pointed ears, shaggy hair, and a perpetual readiness to laugh, chase, and play the pipes. In art, they frequently appear near Dionysus, the god of ecstatic celebration, and that connection matters a great deal. Satyrs seem to embody the more unruly side of festivity, the part where merriment tips into excess, and social rules loosen like knots in warm water. Yet even this creature can feel oddly human in its own way, because the satyr mirrors impulses that civilization tries to manage but never fully removes. Ancient audiences may have recognized in him a comic, unsettling reflection of themselves, a reminder that joy and disorder often arrive together in the same night air. Not every strange being in Greek myth was wild and noisy. Some, like the harpies, carried a more chilling atmosphere, as if a storm itself had taken form. These winged figures are usually described as swift women with the bodies of birds of prey, snatching food, carrying off people, or bringing sudden ruin. Their name is often linked to the idea of snatchers, which suits their behavior perfectly. In early stories, they appear not just as random monsters, but as instruments of punishment or divine correction, sent to torment those who have crossed a sacred line. Their presence is brief but memorable. A sudden shadow, a fluttering strike, a meal spoiled, a fate interrupted. Over time, poets and artists gave them different appearances, sometimes more bird-like, sometimes more human, but the feeling remains the same. The harpies are creatures of interruption, the awful moment when what should remain still is carried away into the wind. Far more famous and far more singular is the Sphinx, a being that combines the body of a lion with the head of a woman and, in Greek versions, often the wings of a bird. Though the image appears strange to modern eyes, it carried deep symbolic power in the ancient world, especially because the Sphinx was not merely an animal hybrid but a questioner. In the Theban myth, she sat outside the city and demanded a riddle from travelers, destroying those who failed to answer. That detail gives her a different kind of menace, not just physical threat but intellectual danger. She was a guardian of thresholds where ignorance could become fatal. The Sphinx also reflects how Greek myth absorbed older Near Eastern motifs and reshaped them into local stories. She is both familiar and foreign, beautiful and terrible, a creature whose stillness feels like waiting. The silence before her question may have been as frightening as the riddle itself. If the Sphinx tests the mind, then the sirens test the ear. In older Greek imagination, sirens were not always the mermaid-like figures later tradition made them seem, but birds with women's heads, or women whose voices were so enchanting they seemed to belong to creatures half of the air and half of desire. Their beauty is auditory rather than visual. They do not chase their victims, they sing. And the song in myth is not merely lovely but dangerously precise, as if it reaches some hidden chamber in the soul and loosens restraint there. In the Odyssey, Odysseus must be tied to the mast of his ship so he can hear their song without surrendering to it. That image has endured because it captures an ancient fear, that pleasure itself may become a kind of doom if one listens too closely. The sirens inhabit rocky shores and dangerous waters, places where navigation already demands care. Their music turns those ordinary hazards into a more intimate temptation. Near the edges of sea and shore, Greek storytellers also placed the Nereids, a gentler class of sea nymphs who belong to the old and gracious depth of the Mediterranean. There are said to be 50 of them, daughters of the sea god Nereus and the ocean nymph Dories, and they are often associated with calm waters, protective grace, and the shimmering movement of waves in sunlight. Unlike monstrous sea beings, the Nereids are not usually hostile. They appear to aid sailors, comfort heroes, or accompany more powerful divine figures such as Poseidon. Among them, Thetis became especially well known as the mother of Achilles, linking the marine world to epic fate. In art, Nereids may ride dolphins or sea creatures, their garments flowing like foam. They are reminders that Greek myth did not imagine the ocean only as danger. It also imagined the sea as inhabited by subtle forms of tenderness, beings whose beauty was soft rather than sharp, and whose presence suggested that even the deep could be kind. Very different from the graceful Nereids are the Gorgons, among the most enduringly frightening figures in Greek myth. Their most famous member, Medusa, is often described with snakes for hair and a gaze that turns living beings to stone. But the Gorgons as a group were not simply decorative monsters. They belong to a deep symbolic zone where fear, transformation, and protection overlap. In some early traditions there were multiple Gorgons, not just one. Their faces could be grotesque, their mouths broad and toothy, their expressions fixed between rage and horror. And yet their image was also used apotropaically, meaning it could ward off evil. The terrifying face of a Gorgon was sometimes placed on shields, temples, and amulets precisely because it frightened away harm. This strange double purpose is one of the richest features of Greek myth. The same creature that petrifies can also guard. The same image that kills can also protect. Myth often lives in that tension, where fear becomes a form of defense. Closely related to the Gorgons in tone, though not in exact shape, are the Scylla and Charybdis of seafaring legend, those paired dangers that transform navigation into a choice between terrors. Scylla is often imagined as a many-headed sea monster lurking in a cliffside cave, while Charybdis is a vast whirlpool that swallows and spits back the sea itself. They are not creatures in the ordinary sense, because one is almost a place and the other almost a force, yet mythology treats them as living threats. Sailors passing between them had to choose a narrow route, and the phrase, between Scylla and Charybdis, still describes being trapped between two bad options. What makes them especially haunting is their setting. The danger is not out in the deep ocean alone, but in a strait, a passage, a place where land and water press close together. Greek myth often locates horror at boundaries like this, where certainty narrows and every movement matters. Another boundary creature, though more shadowy and less monstrous in appearance, is Chiron's kind of kin in the mountain world, the Lamia. Stories about Lamia vary greatly, and that variation itself is part of her importance. In some accounts, she is a queen or beautiful woman transformed by grief and divine punishment into a child-devouring figure. In others, her name becomes a kind of warning used for dangerous female spirits or predatory beings. Ancient writers and later folklore often blended her with other night creatures, creating a shifting image rather than a fixed one. She may appear serpent-like, or as a woman with unsettling hunger, or as an allegory for maternal loss twisted into nightmare. The Lamia is one of those beings whose myth seems to gather around human anxiety. Fear of abandoned children, fear of the night, fear of a beauty that has turned cold. Because her story changes so much over time, she reminds us that myth is not a stone statue but a moving current, carrying older fears into new shapes. There is also a quieter and more elusive class of creature in Greek tradition, the dryads, the spirits of trees. Unlike many of the more dramatic monsters, dryads are not defined by violence or terror. They are bound to the life of the woods, especially to oak trees in some traditions, and they represent the idea that a tree is not merely wood and leaf, but a living presence with its own breath and dignity. To harm the tree could be to harm the spirit within it. This belief gave sacred weight to forests and groves, which were often treated as places of reverence as much as shelter. Dryads belong to the same broad mythic atmosphere as nymphs, yet they feel especially intimate because their life is so closely tied to a particular trunk, a particular root system, a particular patch of shade. In a world where forests supplied food, wood, and refuge, it was natural to imagine that the trees themselves might quietly watch the humans moving beneath them. Finally, there is the strange and enduring figure of the Minotaur, perhaps one of the most famous hybrids in all Greek mythology. With the body of a man and the head of a bull, or at least with the power and nature of. In the long, shadowed tradition of Greek myth, the Sphinx appears as one of the most unsettling creatures because it is not only dangerous but thoughtful. In some tellings, she has the body of a lion, the wings of a great bird, and the face of a woman, a combination that feels almost like a puzzle assembled from different edges of the natural world. She is remembered most vividly in the story of Oedipus, where she waits outside Thebes and asks her famous riddle to travelers who pass by in the morning dust. What makes her memorable is not simply her appetite for destruction, but her association with intelligence turned severe, almost ceremonial. Some scholars note that Greek representations may have been influenced by older Near Eastern images of guardian beasts, while others see the Sphinx as a specifically Greek symbol of the terror that comes with unanswered questions. In art, she can look calm, elegant even, as though she were carved from silence itself. Yet beneath that stillness is the suggestion of a voice speaking from the border between human reason and the wild, a voice that cannot be ignored. From there, the myths drift into the open sea, where the sirens wait with a different kind of danger. They are often imagined today as beautiful women singing beside the water, but in older Greek art and poetry they were not always so human in appearance. Sometimes they had the bodies of birds and the faces of maidens, creatures of feathers and wind rather than scales and fins. Their power lies in sound, not strength, which gives them a strangely intimate kind of menace. They do not chase ships, they call to them. They tempt sailors into drifting toward rocks, toward ruin, toward the kind of listening that becomes surrender. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus has himself tied to the mast so he may hear the song without giving into it, while his crew rows on with wax in their ears. That image has endured for centuries because it feels so precise, almost domestic in its terror, rope, wax, wood, and a voice carrying over bright water. The sirens remind us that in Greek myth, peril is often most potent when it arrives as beauty. And as the ship moves farther along the mythic coast, the sea itself seems to populate with creatures of other kinds, including the strange horsemen known as centaurs. These beings are often described as half man and half horse, with a human torso growing from the body of a stallion, and they occupy a fascinating place between discipline and wildness. In the Greek imagination, they were not all the same. Some were unruly, drunk, and dangerous, famous for violence at weddings and feasts, while others, such as Chiron, were wise, skilled in medicine, and associated with teaching heroes. This split is important because it shows how the centaur became a symbol not just of hybridity, but of the tension within human nature itself. The lower half, powerful and animal, suggests instinct and motion. The upper half suggests speech, thought, and self-command. Ancient vase paintings often show centaurs in the midst of lively struggle, their bodies angled with sudden movement, as if they are forever caught between restraint and charge. They are not simple monsters so much as living arguments about what it means to be civilized. A quieter but equally curious figure is the satyr, whose place in myth feels softened by laughter and wine. Satyrs belong to the world of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, theatre, and intoxication, and they are usually imagined as part human, part goat with pointed ears, shaggy legs, and an unruly appetite for pleasure. Unlike some monstrous beings, satyrs are not always portrayed as outright threats. Instead, they embody excess, mischief, desire, and the loosening of ordinary rules. In festival culture, they seem to belong to the woodland edge where order grows thin and the music becomes more playful. Old stories and plays often use them for comic relief, but their comedy has a nervous edge because they also remind the listener how fragile human manners can be. In art, especially on pottery, satyrs leap, dance, pursue, and gesture in scenes full of movement and celebration. Their energy suggests that Greek myth was not only concerned with fear and punishment, but also with the strange, bubbling unrest beneath joy. Farther into the mountain imagination comes Pan, who is not exactly a monster, but often carries the same wild weather around him. Pan is the god of shepherds, flocks, caves, and lonely places, and though his goat legs and horned face made him appear strange to later eyes, he was deeply rooted in the landscape of rural Greece. The very word panic is linked to his name, reflecting the sudden fear that might seize travelers in secluded places when a sound echoed unexpectedly through ravines or among trees. This connection feels especially fitting because Pan belongs to the hours when the world is half-lit, when the hills are warm and the air hums with insects, yet some unseen movement can still startle the heart. He plays the syrinx or panpipes, a gentle instrument made from reeds, and that softness is part of what makes him so distinctive. Pan is not merely savage, he is nature's own uneven expression, both comforting and alarming. In a mythology crowded with battles, he represents the wilderness that does not need to attack in order to unsettle. If Pan is the voice of the hillside, the harpies are like the wind itself given a restless shape. Their name is often associated with seizing or snatching, and in many stories they are depicted as bird-like women or women with wings, swift and abrupt, appearing where something must be carried away. They are infamous in the tale of Phineus, a king punished by the gods, whose food is repeatedly stolen or fouled before he can eat it. The harpies bring not only hunger but humiliation, turning the ordinary act of a meal into something impossible. Their presence in myth often feels like a curse made visible, a sign that an unseen moral disorder has taken wing. Ancient artists did not always agree on their appearance. Some early forms are more bird than human, while later versions become increasingly woman-like. That shifting shape seems appropriate for beings so tied to gusts, disturbance, and sudden intrusion. The harpies remind us that Greek mythical creatures are often less about fixed form than about force, especially the force of interruption. In another corner of the mythic world, the Gorgons hold a darker and more famous power. Among them, Medusa became the most widely known, though the Gorgons as a group were originally fearsome creatures whose very gaze could petrify the living. Their hair of serpents, if one follows the later and best-known tradition, creates an image that is both beautiful and dreadful, since the snakes curve like living ornaments around the face. Some scholars have suggested that the Gorgons may preserve much older ideas of apotropaic figures, creatures designed to repel evil by being so frightening themselves that they turn danger away. This may help explain why Medusa's face appears not only in myths, but on shields, temple decorations, and protective devices. There is a strange comfort in that logic. What is most terrible can also guard a threshold. And yet the story is never entirely peaceful, because the Gorgon remains an emblem of transformed suffering, of the boundary between victim and monster, between looking and being changed by what is seen. The stillness of her gaze has echoed for thousands of years. Among the more obscure beings are the Lamia, whose legends seem to drift between monster story and cautionary tale. In later Greek tradition, a Lamia can be a child-devouring female figure, but the name may have covered more than one kind of being over time. There are old associations with a queen or woman doomed by divine loss, and later retellings turn that sorrow into horror, linking Lamia with predation, grief, and nocturnal threat. This kind of layering is common in Greek myth, where a name may gather new meanings as it passes through centuries of retelling. The Lamia often becomes a figure used to frighten children or warn against wandering into darkness, yet even then there remains an undercurrent of pity, because the creature is sometimes connected to suffering as much as evil. In that sense, Lamia belongs to a family of myths where monstrousness is not born whole, but shaped by loss, punishment, and the slow pressure of story. The result is a figure that feels more tragic than simple, lingering at the edge of lamplight. Then there are the Empausai, less famous than the Gorgons or Sirens, but equally haunting in their own quiet way. These beings are often associated with the goddess Hecate, with nighttime roads, with the loneliness of travelers, and with deceptive appearances. In some accounts they shift form, appearing as a beautiful woman in one moment and a terrifying figure the next, with one leg of brass or bronze and another of something more ordinary. Their uneven body suggests instability itself, as if the ground beneath identity has begun to wobble. Ancient comedy and later folklore sometimes used Empausai to frighten or amuse, but their deeper role lies in the uncertainty they bring to the dark. A person walking alone at night may see, or think they see, a form beside the path, and the mind fills in what the eyes cannot hold. The Empausai live in that uncertain place where imagination and fear begin to collaborate. They are not always loud in myth, but they are very good at making silence feel inhabited. Finally, the Telchens offer a reminder that Greek mythical creatures were not always purely monstrous and not always purely evil. These strange figures, often associated with the island of Rhodes, were said to be skilled craftsmen and metalworkers, yet also magical, dangerous, and in some stories destructive. Their appearance varies across sources, which is part of what makes them so elusive. Some traditions describe them with fish-like features or dog-like heads, while others focus less on. In the myths of ancient Greece, some creatures were not merely beasts to be feared, but signs of the world's hidden order. The griffin belonged to that category. With the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle, it seemed to combine the dignity of the earth with the sharpness of the sky. Greek writers knew the griffin from stories that may have reached them through Persia and farther east, where gold was said to lie beneath the guarding eyes of these strange hybrids. In art, the creature often appears poised and alert, as if listening to a sound too distant for human ears. It is easy to imagine a traveler in the dusk, seeing a griffin carved on a temple wall or painted on a vase, and feeling that the world was larger and more mysterious than he had first believed. Some scholars think the griffin's popularity came partly from this sense of distant luxury and danger, since it stood near treasure, sacred places, and royal power, Yet it also had a kind of elegance. Its feathers and fur belonged to two noble animals, and in later imagination it became less a monster than a sentinel, quietly guarding a threshold between the ordinary world and something more radiant. Very different and far more unsettling was the harpy. The name itself suggests a snatching or seizing, and that is exactly how these beings behaved in myth. Harpies were often described as birds with the faces or upper bodies of women, although the details change from story to story. They were said to descend suddenly, taking food, voices, or even people, leaving behind a smell of decay and a trace of wind. In the tale of Phineas, they torment a blind seer by stealing or defiling his meals, a punishment so intimate that it becomes almost unbearable to picture. Greek imagination frequently used harpies to represent forces that interrupt order without warning, and their wings make them feel like embodiments of sudden appetite or storm-driven ruin. Even so, their image was not fixed. On some ancient vessels they appear more decorative than monstrous, graceful as they circle through the air. The contrast is striking. A creature associated with misery can also be rendered with fine lines and delicate curves. That tension is part of what makes myth so enduring. It never settles into one meaning for long. Near the edge of the sea, where cliffs meet spray and hidden reefs, catch the light, ancient storytellers imagined creatures that belonged partly to the human world and partly to something older and deeper. The sirens are among the most famous of these. Today they are often pictured as mermaid-like figures, but in earlier Greek tradition they were more often bird-bodied beings with human heads, seated on rocky shores and singing with an unbearable sweetness. Their power was not physical strength, but knowledge and lure. They promised revelation, and perhaps that is why Odysseus had to hear them while bound to the mast, unable to obey the pull of their song. The sirens feel almost scholarly in a strange way, as if they speak in perfect arguments too tempting to resist. Yet their music leads toward loss. Ancient artists sometimes placed them on funerary objects, where they could symbolize both grief and transition, as if the song that draws a sailor to destruction might also accompany a soul beyond life. Their feathers, their voices, and their distance from land create a calm but haunting image, one that seems to drift on the air long after the story ends. Not all Greek mythical creatures were frightening. Some seem to have emerged from the same world of wonder, but with a gentler pulse. The centaur is a good example, though even centaurs could be dangerous. With the upper body of a human joined to the hindquarters of a horse, the centaur represented a joining that could be read in more than one way. It could suggest a noble command over instinct, or a troubling imbalance between reason and appetite. In myth, centaurs are often associated with feasts, mountain caves, and sudden violence, especially when wine loosens restraint. But they are not all the same. Chiron, the wise centaur, was a teacher of heroes and a healer of wounds, and his difference from the unruly centaurs around him is carefully emphasized. That variety may reflect how the Greeks thought about the animal and the civilized, the trained and the wild. A centaur galloping across a painted bowl would have looked astonishingly alive, the horse half in motion, the human torso upright and watchful. There is something almost dreamlike in the image, as if two ways of being had been stitched together in one body. And perhaps that is why centaurs remain so memorable. They are not simply hybrids, but questions about how a creature should live. Some monsters were born less from nature than from imagination's ability to multiply fear. The Empousa, for example, belongs to the shadowy borderland of demonic female figures. She appears in sources as a shape-shifter, sometimes beautiful, sometimes hideous, with one leg said to be bronze and another made of another substance, a detail that gives her an unstable, uncanny presence. She is linked to Hecate, to crossroads, and to nocturnal terrors, and later writers associate her with frightening encounters that seem designed to unsettle travelers after dark. The Empousa often appears in comic or satirical contexts too, which is a reminder that Greek myths could be playful even in their darkness. A scholar reading these references may find it difficult to separate ritual belief from theatrical exaggeration. Was the Empouser a true folk monster, a literary invention, or a little of both? The answer is probably all three, which is typical of mythic creatures that live in the overlap between story and sensation. In A Quiet Room at Night, the Empouser does not arrive with thunder. She arrives with a thought, a flicker of unease, a sense that the far end of the corridor has become slightly longer than before. The satyrs offer a different kind of unease, one that is often softened by laughter, music, and dance. These companions of Dionysus have the bodies of men with animal features, usually goat-like ears, tails, and sometimes shaggy legs. They belong to the realm of fertility, wine, impulse, and the untamed countryside. In many images they are shamelessly cheerful, always pursuing pleasure, playing pipes, or stumbling after nymphs. Yet beneath the comedy there is something ancient and earthy about them. Satyrs remind us that the Greeks did not separate joy from excess as neatly as modern readers might expect. A feast could slide into frenzy, and festivity could reveal the raw pulse of life itself. Their association with theatre is also important, since satyr plays followed tragedies in festival settings, offering a rough, bawdy release after solemn drama. The satyr was therefore both a creature and a performance, a mask for desires that society could joke about while still recognizing them as real. In The Shade of Olive Trees or in A Wine-Dark Celebration, a satyr seems to belong to the air of things growing warm and slightly unsteady. The Sphinx, by contrast, is a creature of stillness and question. In Greek myth, especially the Theban cycle, it is usually imagined with the body of a lion, the wings of a bird, and the face of a woman. It sits in waiting, not roaming, and that makes it feel even more ominous. The famous riddle of the Sphinx turns brute violence into intellectual danger. Those who fail to answer are destroyed. There is something deeply Greek in that, the transformation of horror into a test of mind. The Sphinx in later art and architecture often appears serene, almost regal, which only adds to the tension. The creature may have roots in Old and Near Eastern iconography, and Greek adaptation gave it a distinct narrative role. Unlike monsters that attack at random, the Sphinx demands interpretation. It is a puzzle at the edge of a city, a challenge to identity and speech. Its feathers and claws remain motionless while its question hangs in the air. That image can feel oddly restful too, because it asks for thought rather than chase. Yet the silence around a sphinx is never empty. It is full of waiting. Some Greek creatures carried the memory of ancient nature worship, when sacred groves and springs seemed alive with watchful spirits. Dryads and nymphs do not always count as monsters, but they are undeniably mythic beings tied to the living landscape. Dryads in particular are tree nymphs whose lives are bound to forests and sometimes to specific trees. If the tree suffers, so may the dryad. This idea gives the woods a delicate intimacy. A cracked branch, a fallen trunk, the rustle of leaves in the evening wind, all become part of a larger breathing world. Greek literature often treats nymphs as beautiful and elusive, creatures glimpsed near water, under hills, or among blossoms. They are not built for direct confrontation like dragons or sphinxes, but they shape the emotional atmosphere of myth. Their presence suggests that the world is inhabited, that place itself has a personality. In some stories they inspire love, in others they vanish the moment a mortal reaches for them. Scholars sometimes caution against reading them too literally as supernatural beings, since they may also represent the personification of natural forces. Still, the effect is the same. A grove becomes more than a grove when a dryad might be sleeping inside its bark. The dragon of Greek myth, or draken, is another creature that resists modern simplification. Unlike the winged, fire-breathing dragons of later fantasy, Greek dragons are often serpentine, sometimes enormous, sometimes many-headed, and frequently tied to springs, sacred places, or treasures. The dragon that guards the Golden Fleece, or the one slain near Thebes or Delphi, is not just a beast but a challenge to rightful order. These creatures often stand at the margins of civilization, where a hero must prove worth by overcoming ancient chaos. But even here the symbolism is subtle. The Greek draken can also be a guardian. In the quiet corners of Greek myth, there are creatures that seem less like monsters and more like living symbols of fear, wonder, and the ancient world's way of explaining what could not be easily understood. Some guarded treasure, some haunted rivers and crossroads, and some belonged to stories so old that their exact shape changed as they were retold from island to island, poet to poet. As night settles, it is strangely soothing to imagine these beings not as threats, but as part of a vast and patient mythology, full of moonlit landscapes, whispering reeds, and the distant sound of waves against stone. Among the gentlest of these strange beings, though only in appearance, was the siren, a creature whose image shifted over time. In later art, sirens are often shown as half woman and half bird, perched on rocky islets with feathers catching the sea wind. In the oldest surviving stories, they are less a matter of anatomy than of atmosphere. Their power lies in song, not in claws or teeth. They call to sailors from hidden shores, promising knowledge, rest, or pleasure, and their voices are so exquisite that even wise men can forget the direction of the wind. The danger is not sudden violence but surrender. A ship drifts closer, the oars slow, and the sea remains calm while the minds aboard are quietly undone. In this way, the siren belongs to one of the most enduring Greek ideas, that beauty itself can be perilous when it leads the traveler away from home. Nearby in the mythic imagination stands Scylla, another creature shaped by the sea's uncertain moods. Her story is tangled with transformation, sorrow, and the cruel collisions of gods and mortals. In Homer, she is a terrible hazard in a narrow strait, hidden in a cave and reaching out with many long necks and snapping heads. Later poets and artists made her even more elaborate, surrounding her with dogs, fins, or serpentine forms. But whatever her shape, Scylla represents a place where navigation becomes a moral as well as physical challenge. Sail too close and you are taken, veer away and another danger may await. Ancient sailors knew such waters in a practical sense, with reefs, whirlpools, and sudden currents, yet myth turns those hazards into a being with a personality. She becomes the face of the sea's indifference, the kind of menace that does not rage but simply waits. Across from her in the same legendary passage is Charybdis, not so much a creature in the ordinary sense as a devouring force given a name and a body. She swallows the sea and then belches it back, creating a terrible whirlpool that threatens to pull ships apart. Her story feels almost elemental, as if the Greeks had looked at the turn of tides or the churn of a dangerous channel and chosen to imagine appetite itself in liquid form. Charybdis does not stalk or hunt. She opens, closes, and consumes. In later retellings, she is paired forever with Scylla, two hazards on opposite sides of a strait, giving rise to the famous image of being forced to choose between one danger and another. That small stretch of water becomes a lasting lesson in impossible choices, the sort that feel especially ancient because they never really stop occurring in human life. If the sea held monsters, the earth held its own. The Hydra, for example, emerges from the marshes of Lerna as a creature of multiplying trouble. It is most famous for the way its heads return when cut, a detail that has made it one of the most recognizable images in all of mythic storytelling. But the Hydra is more than a puzzle of anatomy. It is a narrative of persistence, regeneration, and the frustration of simple solutions. Each victory seems to create more work. Each wound becomes a starting point for another threat. Heracles must adapt, cauterizing the necks and preventing the heads from returning, turning strength into strategy. In older symbolic readings, the Hydra often seems to stand for the kind of problem that deepens under pressure, something like a swamp, a plague, or a political crisis, where striking at the surface only reveals more beneath. The creature's damp, reedy habitat adds to the feeling, as though the whole marsh is breathing. Not far from that world of wet thickets and difficult endings is the Sphinx, perhaps one of the most enigmatic beings to appear in Greek myth. She is usually pictured with a woman's face, a lion's body, and the wings of a bird of prey. Yet even this familiar form may not capture all the ways she was imagined in different places and periods. In Greek tragedy and legend, the Sphinx sits outside Thebes and asks her devastating riddle, making knowledge itself a test of survival. There is something deeply still about her. She does not chase her victims through the hills. She waits with the patient severity of a statue, and only when approached does she speak. Her role links monster and oracle, because the answer to her question is not merely cleverness but insight into the human condition. In many versions, she embodies the boundary between the understandable and the obscure, the place where language itself becomes a threshold. Her gaze is steady, almost ceremonial, as if she belongs to the cold discipline of riddles and dawn. The chimera is stranger still, a beast stitched together from several others and therefore difficult to picture without feeling the instability of the whole mythic world. Usually she is described as lion in front, goat in the middle, serpent or dragon at the tail, and sometimes her breath is said to blaze with fire. The creature seems assembled from incompatible forces, as if nature itself had become experimental in a moment of divine excess. Ancient artists delighted in representing hybrid beings, and the chimera may reflect both imaginative freedom and the reality of frightening animals observed in distorted reports from distant lands. Over time, the word itself came to mean any impossible mixture, any dreamlike combination that should not exist but does. The strange thing about the chimera is that she feels both specific and abstract, grounded in a physical form yet always sliding toward metaphor. She is the image of confusion given fur, scales, and heat. Some mythical creatures appear not as single animals but as populations, graceful and unsettling at once. The centaurs occupy exactly that kind of place in Greek imagination, part human and part horse, and forever associated with the tension between reason and instinct. In art and story, they move through forests, mountains, and wind dark celebrations with a mixture of force and unpredictability. Many of them are portrayed as unruly, but not all are vicious. Chiron, the wise centaur, stands apart as a teacher of heroes, a reminder that a hybrid form does not always imply corruption. Instead, the centaur often symbolizes the divided self, the being that carries civilized thought above while remaining tied to bodily motion below. Their image may also have grown from encounters with horse-riding peoples, which to some observers might have seemed like a single fused creature moving across the landscape. However the idea began, it became one of myth's most enduring ways of exploring the meeting point between discipline and desire. Even more domestic in setting, though no less mysterious, are the Laestrygonians, the cannibal giants who appear in the wanderings of Odysseus. They are not usually given the rich, iconic shape of the Sphinx or Chimera, yet they have a power all their own because they turn a harbor into a trap. Their world feels like a coastal village, one with steep cliffs, narrow approaches, and an uncanny silence. Then suddenly the giants appear, throwing stones, wrecking ships, and consuming men as though the sea has opened onto a nightmare version of hospitality. The Laestrygonians remind us that in myth, scale can shift without warning. A place that seems safe can become immense and terrible. A bay becomes a mouth. A city becomes a cave. Their story has a rough, northern atmosphere, almost cold in its cruelty, as if the bright daylight of a harbor were only a thin veil over something primordial. Some creatures, by contrast, are tied not to danger alone, but to ceremony, secrecy, and the slow rhythms of growth. The Hesperides are often called nymphs, though their role in Greek myth has a kind of magical creatureliness, especially because they guard the golden apples at the edge of the world. Their garden is a place of dusk, perhaps of eternal evening, where fruit glows among leaves and the boundary between human longing and divine possession becomes beautifully blurred. Sometimes a dragon or serpent is said to guard the tree with them, adding another layer of protection and unease. but the Hesperides themselves remain gentler in tone than many other mythic beings. They seem almost to sing quietly in the background of the story, tending a place no ordinary traveler may enter. Their existence suggests that not every creature of myth is meant to frighten. Some are custodians of distance, guardians of beauty that must remain just out of reach to preserve its mystery. In a darker and more humanly intimate register, the Erinyes or Furies haunt the moral architecture of Greek myth. They are not exactly beasts, yet they often appear with terrifying, almost creature-like force, winged women with snakes in their hair, torches in their hands, and a relentless capacity for pursuit. They embody vengeance, especially for blood guilt within families, and their presence transforms guilt into something physical, something that follows a person through the dark. The Erinyes are deeply atmospheric figures. One imagines stone halls, fading torchlight, and footsteps that do not stop even when the world grows quiet. They are not random monsters, but instruments of ancient justice, however severe. Their power lies in their refusal to forget. Where some creatures embody wildness, the Furies embody memory. They remind the listener that in Greek myth, the boundary between monster and function is often thin, and that terror itself may be woven into the order of the universe. As the myths grow older,